Boa noite. Chegamos, Piquet, a esse momento maravilhoso, depois da Colômbia, sermos agraciados aí com esse case fantástico. Estamos de novo aqui no nosso segundo Encontro Internacional de Territórios Criativos para o Desenvolvimento Sustentável. Meu nome é Clarice Stefani Teixeira, sou professora da Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, líder do grupo VIA Estação Conhecimento. Estou aqui com Jorge Piquet, UrbsNova, Distrito C de Porto Alegre. Piquet, vamos direto ao ponto, para não perdermos um minuto dessa preciosidade. Temos aí dois nomes, né? E abrilhantando a nossa noite, Pratt. Piquet, por favor, chame nossa mediadora
Pratt,
maravilhosa Edna.
Lembrando também, acabamos de ver Colômbia, amanhã teremos Colômbia novamente, com o Ivan falando das políticas nacionais de territórios criativos, ou territórios naranja, como eles chamam, tá? Então nós vamos chamar a nossa amiga Edna. Edna, vem aqui para a mesa. Está chegando. Bem-vinda, Edna.
Sim. Estão me ouvindo? Que ótimo.
Sim, estamos te ouvindo. A Edna vai moderar esse painel, mas antes eu vou apresentar a Edna para vocês. A Edna já participou do primeiro encontro que a gente fez em 2021. A Edna dos Santos Duisenberg é economista, mestra em políticas de desenvolvimento, com 30 anos de carreira nas organizações das Nações Unidas em Genebra, tendo fundado e dirigido o Programa de Economia Criativa da UNCTAD. Presidiu o grupo multiagência das Nações Unidas sobre Indústrias Criativas. No UNITAR, elaborou a Iniciativa Internacional de Capacitação em Economia Criativa para Governos e Jovens Criativos em Países em Desenvolvimento. Atualmente, Edna é vice-presidente da Federação Internacional de Ações de Multimídia, a FIAM, membro do Conselho Internacional Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Center do Reino Unido e também membro do Conselho Global de Economia Criativa, além de prestar assessoria a governos e instituições e compartilhar reflexões sobre a economia criativa em seu próprio canal do YouTube, que depois a gente pode colocar no chat do YouTube para as pessoas conhecerem.
Bem, boa noite a todos no Brasil. Para mim é um pouco tarde, pois estou em Genebra e aqui já são 11h15, mas é com grande prazer que este ano também vim prestigiar o segundo Encontro Internacional de Territórios Criativos. E realmente felicito a equipe dos organizadores em Porto Alegre, em particular meu querido amigo Jorge Piquet, que é a força motora do Distrito Criativo de Porto Alegre, e o grupo de pesquisa da VIA Estação Conhecimento da Universidade de Santa Catarina, em Florianópolis, a quem eu envio um grande abraço, a professora Clarissa. Eu devo dizer que o evento está trazendo uma lista incrível de palestrantes brasileiros e estrangeiros. Muitos são amigos de longa data. E quero dizer que muito aprendi no dia de hoje, pois recebi uma injeção de ânimo e ao tomar conhecimento de tantos projetos e tanto trabalho importante que está sendo realizado no Brasil para dinamizar a economia criativa. Well, now let me turn it to our guests. So, good evening. Now in Brazil. It's okay? It's okay?
Hello?
The voice? I'm here
Can you hear me?
myself. Okay. So good evening to everybody. Now it's evening in Brazil and quite late in Europe. It's 11 p.m. in Geneva. But of course, we have a very special reason to attend this session in a Friday night. And this reason is because it's always a pleasure to listen to and learn from my dear friend from many years, Professor Andy Pratt. Andy has an impressive academic biography. He was professor at the various prestigious universities in London, such as University College of London, the London School of Economics, and the King's College. In 2013, he joined the City University of London, and he is director of the Center for Culture and the Creative Industries. And he holds the first UNESCO chair in Global Creative Economy in 2022. He worked as consultant or advisor to several international institutions, such as UNCTAD, UNESCO, WIPO, as well as the European Union and the British Council. So, Andy, welcome. We are very happy to listen to you. So you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me and welcoming me. I hope you can hear me okay. It's just started a very heavy thunderstorm where I am at the moment, so it's causing a bit of a problem. But anyway, thank you for your patience of listening to me in English. I'm sorry I don't speak Portuguese as the rest of the conference is in there. What I want to talk about today is about two things: international production networks and cultural ecosystems. And what I want to ask some questions about and try to help us understand what these are and why they matter. If I can choose to the next slide. Okay, that's working now. I can't quite see the slide on the presentation there. Can you see the second slide now? So it says overview. Yes, okay, sorry about that, sorry. Okay, so what I want to talk about in terms of this issue about international production networks and cultural ecosystems is start off by saying something about the trends in the creative economy, but also about the gaps in our knowledge. And particularly what I want to focus on this evening is about the missing dimension of which is about organization, the organization of the cultural and creative industries. I think this is something that we're still struggling to get a hold on, but I think that it's a really important aspect of understanding how the cultural and creative economy operates. And particularly, I want to talk about global production networks and the way that not just that, obviously, production is cross-border and international, but the structure of these networks and how it affects cultural production. And I guess when we think about production networks, we can think about them in terms of different scales. And whilst we talk about international production networks, we can also talk about them in relation to clusters and hubs. So these are a different scale of production networks. I want to refer to those as well. I guess one of the other things that I want to touch upon is that whilst we have primarily information about some of the economic metrics and indicators about the creative economy, what we have less information about are about the social and cultural context of the cultural and creative economy. So I want to refer to that as an important part of this, and I'll end up by saying what I think is probably some things we need to be thinking about in terms of the implications for policy when we take seriously organizational forms of the creative economy and issues to do with process of this activity. What I want to do is to challenge some assumptions that maybe you have and certainly are around in the literature about what we mean by clusters, cultural clusters or hubs in this way, and also about international trade. Because a lot of the assumptions from many commentators around this area, is that creative clusters are primarily about co-location, and they're about also market proximity. And I want to challenge this by not denying that they are partly about those things, but saying that they're about something much more. And actually, the more about the relationship between the different activities is perhaps the one that's most significant in terms of thinking about policy and debates as well. Likewise, in international trade, although obviously we're concerned about issues associated with tariffs and trade barriers, these are an important part of the way that we understand the barriers to international trade. Again, what I want to stress is that it's the organization of cultural production across space and time that is an important part of this, that creates the issues that are associated with tariffs and trade barriers. So I want to stress and foreground the structural relations of cultural production and its organization, questions associated with risk and scale, and actually the creativity of organization that seeks to resolve some of these problems. And I want to bear in mind some of the issues about the embedding, and that is the close interrelationship with local cultures and social contexts as well. But overall, stressing the importance of the flow of activities and process rather than what often we have is data and understanding that is about rather static situations. Let's just begin with some of the headline trends that we are all familiar with, that are now we have a reporting system of numbers of reports and agencies that are producing now information about the creative economy, of course. And the picture that we get of this is a complex one, but we have seen significantly that there's been trade growth in the creative economy, one that exceeds many other traditional industries, and especially the rate of growth has been greater in the global south. That even in the recession of the 2008 period, the creative economy was reasonable. The scale of activities is growing, and although the overall level of activity is greater in the global north. And I guess related to this, there is also the massive underreporting of the trade in services and also intellectual property rights associated with the creative economy. These are problems that, in a sense, we've inherited, and in fact, because, of course, the world's trade is moving from a material to an immaterial process, but the recording of that in terms of trade statistics, etc., it has not caught up with that process. So we're under this process of digitization. So this is the story of the past 20 years or so, that the creative economy is growing, and we're taking that on board. Politicians have begun to wake up to this. More resources have been put in this direction. And we did see some reaction in the period of COVID, when there were massive impacts on the creative sector of attempts to try to address some of these issues. So they're all things that we take for granted, and these are obviously important issues that have really foreground the creative economy. But what I want to just refer to is the fact that there is another side of the creative economy, which is sadly relatively underreported dimensions of fairly significant inequalities associated with the form and the operation of the creative economy. And I guess I want to point to some of these issues because I think we've all recognized that this has been an issue along the way, but I think these issues aren't going away, that we need to address them. And the current reporting frameworks that we have are not emphasizing these issues as sufficiently as they might. So there are issues associated with representation. So if you like, if we think about this in terms of audiovisual, well, this is what happens on the screen. It's what the images that we see, the representations of culture, of people, and their various characteristics here. So there's been a huge challenge that has come across the world recently in terms of representations of who appears on screen to be reflective of those actual societies. So there are questions here of the balance with the cultural context in terms of representations and the domination of particular groups in that way. So that's one aspect that we are seeing more attention to, although having a clear reporting process for that is challenging. The other aspect of this, of course, is behind the screen, and all of the backstage activities. Most of the work in the creative economy is of these activities, of not the people that are necessarily appearing in front of stage. And the associated tasks associated with actually reaching adequate representations of all sections of the population in these activities. So labor markets, education and training are becoming or continue to be a hugely challenging area in terms of trying to address these problems of the creative economy that actually, in many senses, is rather more unequal and unrepresentative than we might expect. We often think that culture is a good tool for conveying wider representations and understanding of society, but as often as not, both those that appear on front of screen, but also the technical jobs are not as equally balanced as we'd want. So again, highlighting these issues and recording them is a really important part of this issue. As I mentioned, in relation to, as we've seen, lots of really inspiring examples in the period of COVID of attempts to try to support the creative economy when no income or audiences were available, but also the amazing resilience of the creative sector. And invariably of freelance workers and temporary enterprises and micro enterprises. But these also are a highlight to us of the incredibly precarious nature of cultural production. And behind the headline figures of economic growth in the cultural economy, there's a very unstable and precarious nature of cultural production. And again, we don't often pay as much attention to the details of this, but also about questions about reforming it in some way. And finally, there are the issues about what is the quality of work in the cultural and creative sector, and particularly the conditions of work particularly in terms of social support. In some areas of the economy, in most countries, we have at least a fair representation of support for social security in terms of health and pensions and maternity and paternity pay. But that support tends to fall away in relation to more precarious forms and short-term forms of working. And therefore, the cultural sector as a whole is under-supported in terms of the social support systems. And therefore, this is a real threat to the sustainability of the sector. And also, of course, it's a big disincentive for people to enter professions associated with the cultural and creative sector. So these are all problems that people have highlighted previously, highlighted on their own. But I think we also need to point to the fact that these are important and challenging problems on their own, but they're also intersectional diversities as well that are problematic in this area. So where we cross over with both gender and age and ethnicity and sexuality, for example, the multiple disadvantage that many people operating in the creative economy suffer. Certainly, there's a call for us to investigate this more, but also create support systems and ways of maintaining and sustaining activities in this area. So those are things that that have been certainly raised and discussed before. But I wanted to point out that these are issues that are associated with us trying to have an understanding of the creative economy that has been dominated by an economic model that has often underplayed some of the social and cultural dimensions. But both of those need support and resource. The point that I made at the beginning is that organization is tremendously important, and the nature of organization in the cultural and creative sector we see manifest many of these problems. And one of the issues that I want to point out to frame this is to frame this in terms of global production networks. So the organization of cultural production is a process that is, to some extent, not so different to the rest of the economy. And in the past 20 or 30 years, there's been a tremendous change in the way that the creative the whole economy is organized. We've seen the trends towards globalization and its complex forms. And certainly the notion of global production networks tries to address these issues of the changing organizational forms that have been occurring. So we're all familiar, I'm sure, with the early parts of this debate, which gave rise to many of the early analysis of globalization, based around transnational corporations with their headquarters, which tended to dominate the command and control activities of organizations, and with the branch plants and the production facilities often in locations that were located simply to exploit cheap labor conditions in this way. So this issue of a spatial division of labor, so a division of labor that's not just in the factory, but is relocated in different parts of the world, was a characteristic of globalization. And this process of globalization wasn't that everything was equally distributed across the world, but it was a structured relationship of domination and control of activities in one part of the world and lower value-added activities elsewhere. This is a sort of familiar story in this way, where you have this sort of system that is a way of reproducing uneven development globally. and often this has reproduced and intensified old colonial patterns as well of trade. The debates about global production networks have developed from this early stage, looking at the more complex processes. First, starting at commodity production, so looking particularly at agricultural goods and the ways in which they reach markets from remote locations. And what was particularly important in this early work on commodities was recognizing that global markets were very much structured around producers or buyers. So the expectation, I guess, that we might have is that producers would control systems. This tends to be more something that happens in the area of manufacturing, but in terms of commodity production, it's often the buyer-dominated parts of production chains. And quite simply, what this ends up with meaning is that in buyer-dominated markets, for example, coffee, for example, that the buyers in North America or Europe set the price which they're prepared to buy coffee for. And you will know very well that this, of course, has significant consequences for agricultural production. So this way in which the control of a global production system can be dictated from either a producer end or a consumer end or buyer end of the production chain, effectively works that you have really important gatekeepers in the system, is that the network is not equally distributed. It's not simply always dominated by one key player, but it's structured around these relationships. So the early work pointed towards producer or buyer-dominated networks, and people started to develop analyses based around the importance of particular lead firms in these networks and the development of strategic partnerships and specialized suppliers. And certainly there was a lot of really important work done on the challenge to the existing structure of these networks, often around upgrading. So in other words, to try to draw back some of the value-added activities so that they don't disappear out of country or to the global north, which was invariably the case with these. And also what's referred to as strategic coupling. Often that means the setting local network relationships to provide more effective flows of activities and making local regions and local and regional clusters of activity more attractive for producers to focus on. So this idea has been developed now into a rather more extensive analysis called global production networks that doesn't just emphasize these complex chains, networks, and the differential power relationships between them and the ways that they can be controlled, but also recognizes that it's not just about the traditional economic actors. There are state actors involved. There are labor organizations and labor movements as part of this multiple actor relationship. And of course, territories play a role in that. Interesting point you towards a recent book called Choke Point Capitalism, which refers is a popularization of a lot of the academic work that's been done in this area, that talks particularly about the way that these gatekeeping activities, or as the authors of this book call it, a choke point, you're able to control systems. This book particularly is about the changing development in the cultural production networks, not just referring to the platform economy, but in terms of the rather more nuanced structure of control in the creative economy. And what I want to talk about next is, so this global production network literature tends to talk about most economic activities, but we know that the cultural and creative activities have some differences, some critical differences, and I've been doing research with a number of colleagues on this in recent years, which has tried to look at the particularity of cultural and creative ecosystems within global production networks. And I guess what this points us to is trying to view the creative economy through a lens that is more nuanced than perhaps we would have gathered from the metrics that normally we see in terms of the creative economy, in terms of output and employment and occupation and trade figures. It tries to break down the creative economy into two dimensions. First, there's about the functional relations. So the relationship through which any creative activity goes through this process of the idea, creating something, making it, and distributing it, exchanging it, and also the process of archiving and critique. So this cycle of cultural production is an important functional steps that things go through. And then there are the different domains, so the different art forms, audio, visual performance, publishing, etc., that have slightly different forms of organization. And this has been talked about obviously before. What is important here is to point to the way that there are interrelationships, not just between the different functions of activities, but between the different domains as well. And this complex interrelationship between these different activities is an important part of the way that the structure of global production networks in the creative economy are formed. And in particular, the embedding in the local economic context and the local social and cultural context is often very, very important for these activities. Whether that's at the creativity stage, or it might be at the archiving stage, or it might be at the other aspects of it. So this is a really important part of recognizing and understanding the more complex organizational relationship that takes place in terms of what's needed to facilitate cultural production. It points to the different scales of activity that some of them are happening at a local level, some are happening at a regional level, and some are happening at an international level. And there are issues about power and control associated with those. So this is challenging the notion that perhaps that often we come to the assumption that cultural activities tend to be very much bound up in one particular place or region, and then they're exported out of that area. But this lens highlights the fact that actually there's a lot more interrelationship between different activities at different scales that we perhaps haven't paid so much attention to previously. Another obvious dimension to this as well is to recognize the environmental flow. So far, I guess, we've been talking about economic flows and the acquisition of or the aggregation of added value to particular places or parts of the production chain, but also we can use a similar sort of model in terms of plotting what happens to the environmental uses of goods and activities as well. So more recently, there has been a lot more attention paid to the energy consumption associated with the cultural sector, the carbon footprints of the cultural sector, and what happens to waste products, for example. And certainly following the production networks across the world is very illuminating here in terms of where waste ends up and how fundamentally sustainable or unsustainable many of our areas of cultural activity can be. So I guess this important point here is about the spatial extent and also the interrelationship between economic forces as well as environmental and social ones. I guess the other point to make when we talk about ecosystems, we often have in our mind some idyllic situation where everything is in balance and that there's a necessary relationship between all the components of a system. The creative and cultural ecosystems aspire to such a situation, but the relations are very unequal and these systems are not balanced. They are very fragile. And in fact, this is an important lesson from an awareness about cultural production systems, is that it's often the system maintenance that is the key issue in terms of the networks and institutions which connect all of the necessary components of production that often are poorly invested in, and there's a weak infrastructure, both a hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, that maintains these cultural production systems. So that highlights the fact that it's not just the transactions that take place, but is the capacity building of the systems that is particularly important. And I just want to give you an example from some work we've been doing in Europe and the Cicerone project that we've been looking at, where we did a number of looked at a number of different production systems, about 25 different production systems of different cultural forms in Europe. And we mapped and followed these different production systems. So rather than starting and just focusing on firms and output, we mapped production systems and looked at the whole system in this way. And here's an example, just as an illustration of craft production here, which you would expect to be fairly localized. And you can see the different phases or different functions of production, the different sorts of activities that are associated with this that we plotted through extensive interviewing with these companies. And we're able to map the spatial footprints as well as where the added value activities were taking place in these areas. So it's an important point to note, is that as I already suggested, that there is this functional relationship between activities, but also that they build into a wider system. So likewise, with a lot of global production network work, people try to look at the more common or dominant network configurations. And certainly in our work in Europe, looking at cultural economy production networks, we saw there were 4 dominant styles of production network. Those that were locally based with multiple actors in them, those that were locally based with a single lead actor, those that were global with multiple actors, and global with single lead actors. I guess that last one, the global with the single lead actor, is what we would more associate perhaps with a traditional manufacturing multinational corporation. But actually, much of what happens in the cultural sector is associated with a far more dispersed set of activities and a multiple interrelationship between these activities. What I want to point out is that the creative economy not only has these complex networks, but the creative economy has its own particularity in terms of the way that it is organized. And often what is seen from the outside as the peculiar organizational forms in the creative sector are often a response to the sorts of risks involved. The creative sector has, compared to many other areas of manufacturing activities, a very high speed of turnover. New products start every week or every month, and that's compared to manufacturing activity, where you're often talking about a year or several years when a product life cycle will last. So this leads to different challenges for creative businesses, and particularly the risk associated with failure is great, and therefore they get managed in portfolios, not on individuals. So this is a way of managing risk so that you can have failure as well as success. And clearly the expectation is that you structure an organization such that in the end you make more money than lose it. But it's an important part to understand that this is part of the construction of the creative economy ecosystem that is reliant upon innovation and new ideas, and therefore you have to have some compensatory slack, if you like, to deal with failure in this. Also, of course, we have the particularity of the larger corporations, where they're platform organizations, and the multiplicity of micro enterprises. And often this is associated with the fact that project-based organizations are comprised of multiple small actors. They're put together to create a team to produce a product for a short period of time, and then that organization is dissolved and another one is set up. This is quite different to the sort of longer term stabilities that we expect to find in the rest of the economy. So this is an important part of this. It's also important, and it's confusing for many economists analyzing this sector, where traditionally one looks at the rate of new firm formation and the birth and death of firms as an indicator of how effective and resilient the economy is. Whereas actually in the cultural sector, you have this rapid turnover and fast birth and death of firms that makes it look as though the economy is not working properly, whereas in fact it is working very efficiently in this peculiar way that the cultural sector organizes itself. So that's an indication that traditional metrics that we often use in economic and business analysis may be deceptive in relation to the cultural sector. They need more attention. Moreover, the contracting relationships, the network relations between companies that form in these networks that are changing so quickly rely not just on price and cost, but on reputation. Because one of the peculiar aspects, as we all know, about the creative economy is that it's not simply the cheapest product, but it's the one that has the most cultural value. And sometimes the balance, the complex balance between the economic value and the cultural value is what we see played out in terms of rather unusual contracting relationships that we see in this place. So there are multiple value systems, not just based on economic value, but based on cultural value. And I don't just mean cultural value in terms of high culture. I mean the different values associated with a particular piece of music, for example. It's a particular quality. So values and qualities of music, the sorts of things that distinguish what is seen as a winning piece of music, piece of theatre, etc., contrasted to something that is just second or third in the chart, if you like. These are what are referred to as winner takes all markets. So if you're the best, then you get monopoly profits in this area. Being third or fourth is fairly significantly bad in the system. So the quality of what is produced, and qualities are a tremendously important part of the organization of the cultural and creative sector. Factoring in these quality issues and also controlling them through the control of networks and ecosystems is an important part of the way that these activities are shaped. And it's not just the traded activities, whether that is cultural quality, cultural value and economic value. It is also the overlap with the informal economy. And again, in cultural ecosystems and production systems, the relationship or the boundary between the formal and the informal is constantly transgressed. And likewise between the for-profit and the not-for-profit. So again, it's a recognition of the need to expand our analyses from the rather more restricted area of most economic analyses, which are about final product price, but are instead about the networks and relationships that sustain these sets of activities in this area. So the consequence of that is the, I guess, some of the insights that we get from looking at production chains is that we see the preponderance of translocal production networks. So production not all happening in one place, but happening across several places and spaces. There being unequal interdependencies between these different functional activities and the locations. That the flows of knowledge that run across these can be critical assets for a region or for industry. But the flows of knowledge are not always reflected in terms of simple sort of price about the price of goods or about the quality of labor. So this knowledge, this local knowledge, the communities of practice that often surround the cultural and creative economy are tremendously important in the cultural and creative sector. And what's really critical here is that these aspects are invisible, invisible to our existing data analyses, and they are relatively invisible to most of the traditional economic analyses, which focuses simply on issues about traded goods and about market price. So the embedding of cultural and creative economies in communities of practice and value production are an important way in which prices emerge from those markets and networks. Remember what I said at the beginning about the global production networks being dominated by producer-dominated or buyer-dominated. These are the things that set the price. It's not a market. It's a structural price-setting activity. And you find this happening, whether it be the price of labor that is forced down in areas of the cultural sector, or your access to a platform network, or as a consumer, the price that Netflix charges in this area. So they're subject to what we'd often refer to as monopolies, but also what are referred to as monosopies, which are basically sort of buyer-dominated controlled networks. So this embedding process is really, really important in the cultural economy. And what I want to stress is that the consequences for this is that the traditional ways that we have of seeking to control the markets of cultural goods through tariff and trade, for example, or between price and location, tend to be relatively less important. In terms of the more important issues are the way that markets are constructed through global production networks, and that they are about these unequal networks and hierarchies, and therefore the target of governance and regulation needs to be pointed in this direction. Prices are only one signal. There are multiple other values at play. And the balance between what is economic and what is cultural in these equations is tremendously complicated. So rather than simply looking at prices and tariffs and in this area, what we need to look at is the organization of cultural production across networks. Find out where the power and control is, to see what room for maneuver local agents have, and particularly what room for maneuver there is to control local culture. Because if the cultural production networks extend outside regions and countries, then basically you've lost control of your culture in terms of being able to make significant strategic decisions in this way. So therefore, this question that is an old one from commodity chain analysis, which is about upgrading, gaining more control over the production of your activities, whilst that's important in manufacturing activities, whilst it's important in commodity production, it's tremendously important in culture. Because this is the control, can you control your own cultural production is an important part of this. And it's not simply what we've seen previously. So I just want to point out that what I think I've suggested, by focusing more on global production networks and the way that they construct the importance of local ecosystems and international ecosystems, mean that we should be a little more wary of the normative approaches that we might assume based on the existing metrics that we see. So the normative policy approaches often are about for example, having a policy of best practice where one size fits all, and that we try to pick winners in these processes. What we need to do is pay more attention to organization and governance, because many of those old policy responses are not going to be effective against a rather more distributed network. We need to be more attentive to the particular organizational forms of cultural production, and there are differences across the different cultural art forms and cultural forms and different market forms, and they're embedded in regions and localities in particular ways. Again, this is a call for more research into these areas, to more information and data gathering, bringing this information to the debate. Recognizing that simply prices and tariffs are only one part of this story. It's about power and control of the issues, and the institutions and networks that act as, if you like, the soft infrastructure that enables cultural production can either be there as a capacity that allows cultural production to take place, or it may be due to the fragility and it breaking down, it to be lost. And certainly in the period of the pandemic, we saw a lot of cultural ecosystems become fragile and break down and unable to actually operate as recovery in the economy took over. However, as I've suggested, there are a number of stumbling blocks here, and I think it's fairly obvious here that we have struggled and still struggle to get a good set of metrics to allow us to monitor and evaluate the development of the creative economy. And certainly there's been a lot of work done there, but we have to recognize that most of these measures that we have based on traditional economic statistics tend to be about output measures. They're not about process. They're not about the temporality and the process of cultural production distributed across systems. And a lot of the fundamental classifications of industries and occupations are so outdated that most of them don't even include measures of the creative economy. So whilst we try very hard to collect that information, there is a desperate need to develop a parallel reporting framework that pays attention to the social and cultural organization of the creative economy and to issues about power and control in these systems. And we need information on the flow of data, the flow of information and flow of resources. That in the old days that we might have had flow data associated with the flow of material products. Immaterial products, and particularly immaterial trade in the cultural sector, is very poorly reported in the world system. And it makes it very, very difficult for us to, A, understand the nature and form of these networks, but also to understand where the value-added activities are and where the value-extracted parts are as well. So these issues that, of course, would potentially challenge policymakers and politicians in terms of thinking about how they retain local intellectual property rights, local value systems, and how they maintain that added value activities return to those regions. These are all questions that are very much up in the air if we do not have a more detailed analysis of these systems. And certainly, as I referred to the Cicciarone project that we've been working on in Europe, which has been both mapping these global production networks in the cultural sector, but also one of the things that we've identified is that we don't have the right data to be able to do this job properly, and therefore creating a new observatory, a collecting site for information about the creative economy is something that we need to do going forward. This is particularly important because no one data source is going to be sufficient on its own. So, the standard statistical sources that governments collect They're one part of the equation. Another part of the equation are what are often proprietary resources that are owned by private corporations. So there are questions about whether some of that information could be moved more into the public domain. There is also information that trade associations have. So there are a number of different actors that potentially could play a role in moving us towards a better understanding of the creative economy outside this rather limited output-orientated version of statistics that we have, and a move more towards process. Because if you have information and understanding of processes, then policies and policy frameworks are going to be more effective, because policy is able to, if you can identify which processes you want to alter, rather than simply effectively being at the end of the pipeline and just switching things on or off, which is unfortunately the situation we're often in terms of our understanding of the creative economy. So this is partly, of course, this is really not going to be something that we can solve tomorrow by any means at all. But I think it's really important that we have a recognition of the limitations of the existing information we have about the creative economy, awareness of the things that it does tell us, but awareness of the gaps as well. And I would argue that it's particularly in these gaps around organization, and particularly about power and control and organization, that would be a really significant area for policymaking, which already tries to focus on issues about capacity building, network resilience, etc., and sustainability, those sorts of issues. Providing more information and more detailed analysis of cultural production networks would put us in a far better position to understand these flows of the cultural economy across places, the degree to which they're embedded or disembedded in places, and to understand the consequences, not just economic, but social, cultural, and environmental, of the flows of cultural goods and services in this area. And I think that is one way that we need to be looking in terms of cultural governance. That's difficult enough though it is at this point in time, but to expand the frame of reference to include understanding global production networks and cultural ecosystems as an integral part of cultural governance in this way, that is all about trying to understand the relationality, the relations between activities and places that are what constitutes the cultural and creative economy. Okay, thanks very much. I hope that has informed in some way and provoked. Hopefully, it's given you some ideas and maybe some questions as well, which I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie. It was really a lot of food for thought. A lot of points you raised, and it's true that so many years we have been looking to the creative economy, but some of the key issues remains on the table, remains on the agenda. For instance, I think was quite interesting the point you made about the importance to have a kind of control of the local creative cultural production. But how you see the role of creative territories, how the creative territories could really work in this direction to facilitate this kind of control, because I think one of the big difficulties we have in the creative economy, as you mentioned, is the structure, the organizational structure, because the creative economy is very segmented. So it's very difficult to really, it's very fragmented, and it's small pieces. So how do you see the way, a very effective way to have a kind of control you mentioned?
Yeah, I thanks for that, Edna. I mean, I think that this precisely is the role of state and civil society organizations, can play this role of a coordinating function. I think that often, as I suggested, the organizational forms of many activities in the creative sector are created to deal with the risks of the relative chaos of the market, and that having a better understanding of the structure of activities can enable the public sector organizations particularly to invest in infrastructure. And this infrastructure might be the provision of particular types of service activities that support the creative economy. They might be about making some connections in the fragmentation. So the fragmentation is a response, a creative response to try to be able to respond in quickly in lots of different areas. But there is an important strategic dimension, that investment in collaboration at the local level can be a way that territories can regain control. But it does mean that territories need to build up this expertise in terms of the understanding of the creative economy. It's a relatively new area of activities. Many of these new activities are micro enterprises, that they're not something that we have many textbooks about. People haven't trained understanding the management of these activities. And I think the issue for those involved in cultural governance at a territory, in local territories, is we need to build the capacity, train cultural policymakers that are based on understanding the way this sector operates. We need relationships with the trade associations in this sector, because they have expertise, as well as civil society groups. So I think policy making needs to expand to draw in a wider range of knowledge in this area, so that we can begin to understand the interdependencies here. But you're dead right. The issue is complete fragmentation. And I mean, just come back to that point again about often trade associations and civil society organizations, that often this label, umbrella term, the creative economy, plays the rhetorical role of trying to pull everything together. But many of the actors say, no, I'm in the film industry. No, I'm in the publishing industry. No, I'm in theatre. And I'm not the same as those people. Well, of course, there are differences. But what we need to do is to recognize that they are based on a similar infrastructure, and often they are codependent in many of their markets and in terms of their skills and resources. And I think building up this expertise, identifying the strengths and weaknesses of local production systems, is definitely something that foregrounds the role of territory and territorial organizations that can help to coordinate some of this fragmentation and often chaos in the cultural area. And that in turn then makes a better organized system. You get returns to scale in terms of the organization and in terms of economic as well as the control of activities. So, yeah, long answer to your question, but it's, I mean, there's the question of fragmentation is a really important one in the cultural sector. And I think we need to fight back against this fragmentation and find ways of coordinating across production systems. And I think territories, civil society and trade associations could be a way to work with state organizations to create that dialogue.
There is a question from Fernando Jimenez, and he's asking, what will be really the role of public policies in this kind of ecosystem that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think the role of the public sector is, I mean, the most effective and most efficient way that the public sector can operate here is not by trying to predict what's going to be popular or what's going to be the next big thing. That's obviously not very helpful. What I think the public sector can do is to provide infrastructure, provide network resources, provide a framework within which creative activities can do the activities that they do. But investing in basic infrastructure is a key area. And that might be, and often is, issues about training. And it is also about sometimes hosting networks that are broken down, providing services that are needed across a production network that is not available locally, that would mean that you would have to go outside the region in order to solve this problem. An efficient, effective investment by a territorial public sector could be a more effective way of making sure that ecosystems get managed. So the public sector, I think, should be playing a role of managing ecosystems, not picking winners, but actually identifying what parts of the ecosystem are broken down, just in the same way that for many years, public networks of, for example, water networks or whatever, they're managed where the leaking takes place, where the broken pipes are, they get fixed, and that means that the whole network operates effectively. I think applying that sort of knowledge and that sort of understanding to the cultural sector obviously is a lot more complicated, but I think we need to build our understanding of the network resources that the cultural economy relies upon to operate. And I think investment in those at a public and local level can be very attractive because obviously it makes it easier to do business. It makes it easier to produce cultural activities in that way.
Okay, thank you. There is another question here from Maria from the University of Santa Catarina. And you mentioned the question of the precarious work. And we have been recently watching the Hollywood script writers strike, asking for better working conditions, among other things. So what are this? How you see this? What is your vision in this matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a perfect illustration of the way that global production networks operate. On one hand, the extent of the disruption, if you like, that has occurred. It shows that the different parts of the network are all linked together. But also it shows where the power and control is. I think it was one of the Hollywood executives basically said that the corporations could wait longer than the workers could for their pay. Clearly, there's a power imbalance here in this that this highlights. And I think clearly the importance of paying people properly, making reasonable jobs in the sector is clearly important. And there's a role for labor relations, and there's a role for corporations in that. I mean, I think one of the things that the recent Hollywood dispute has highlighted has been the threat of artificial intelligence. And I think there are a whole set of questions here about intellectual property rights and who owns those rights. And because, of course, actors earn their continuing income from the residuals in terms of the replay rights of activities. And we're seeing a huge challenge at the moment from large corporations who are seeking to harvest intellectual property to train their artificial intelligence large language machines in this way, and not giving a return to artists. There is a discussion at the moment about whether that large organizations like Google, etc., should end up basically paying royalties or copyright on the training of their large language models. These things, I mean, it sounds rather abstract, but actually, basically, these corporations are basically hoovering up under so-called fair use all of the text that we produce, all of the films that are produced, the images, etc., and then feeding them in these large language models, but not giving the artists their details. I had a particular story this week about the way that voiceovers were being used, and basically voice recordings of all actors have basically been aggregated by the large corporations, and they're able to basically replace those actors, and the actors are not given any money for the use of their voice. So this really fundamental questions about what it is that we can own as creators, whether we own ourselves, our voice, our image, these sorts of things, as well as obviously the more traditional notion of whether we own, have a share in our work, and also get fairly remunerated for our work. Clearly, you know, this issue is not going away, but it does raise the issue of that fair pay for cultural activities is a really fundamental part of the future of the creative economy, whether you are a consumer or a producer.
Yeah. And I think to follow up on this question, I think the impact of artificial intelligence in the creative process itself, because you mentioned already the big issue of the future of the work. And we know that many occupations will disappear, and also the fact of the regulation, because there is a number of, points, pros and cons about the regulation, but how this regulation will work in practice, because there is a lot of question marks, no?
I think it's obviously things are changing very quickly, but the issue associated, I mean, in principle, many of these issues are actually covered by traditional copyright legislation and regulation. It just needs to be enforced, because as I mentioned, the example of the use of actors' voices and their voices being used and trained a machine, and then a machine can say anything that that person said. Yeah, that's, as I said, the corporations are saying, oh, the training the machines, that's under copyright, that's fair use. That's basically, we'll see you in court and we'll dispute that point. But I mean, I think there's a fair case there that actually many of the existing regulations actually can be applied to areas of artificial intelligence, but it needs the test cases, it needs the investment in these, and unfortunately, there's a lot of vested interest not to investigate them in this way. But yeah, it's definitely a key area in all areas of creative work in terms of to what extent artificial intelligence will replace many of those activities and what we'll be left with after them.
Just to finalize, there was another point raised, because indeed you mentioned the factors of a failure. So in your view, what are the success factors of a cultural ecosystem nowadays in the present environment?
Well, the success issues. Yeah, but I mean, I think that many of the those that are operating in ecosystems, understand them. They're built on personal relationships. They're built on shared value systems in that way, and they take time to build, and they need investment in them, whether that is sweat labor or whether it's external investment. But certainly the issue of a longer term investment in building sets of relationships and seeking to maintain them over time is what seems to create more sustainable ecosystems. Unfortunately, if there's a very short-term return or sort of simply looking for a single success, that tends to be corrosive to ecosystems. It doesn't maintain sustain the activity. So I think it's often investing in the maintenance of activities, and really fundamentally the maintenance of those activities, as I say, might be identifying where networks have broken, or where key skills may be missing, can be added, or key resources need adding. But as we saw over the period of the pandemic, the discussion about a universal basic income has gained ground, and particularly in areas of the arts and cultural field, to recognize the importance of maintaining a livelihood over an irregular source of income. And these ideas, I think, are gaining ground that are other ways of sustaining networks. Because obviously, if you as an individual can only work and then you drop out of the network and then join the network again, that's not maintaining the health of the network. So maintaining some sort of basic income can be a way in which you keep the network active in this way as well. So various forms of cultivating and maintaining networks over time can be employed. But I think there is a possibility that our ideas are changing about universal basic income. I mean, this method, of course, as some of you may know, is already applied in France. They have a scheme there that effectively is a basic income for artists and creatives. I think this idea perhaps is one that could be explored elsewhere.
Well, Angie, thank you so much for bringing so many ideas and insights that will help us to reflect on all these issues and try to find some solutions. Let us hope so. So thank you very much. It was always a pleasure to have you and to listen to you. So I also would like to thank the audience that is with us until now, and say that this event is jointly organized by VIA Conhecimento, and we have Clarissa and George there to continue. And I would like to say I was very glad to be with you today. And I wish all the success for the day and the debates that will continue tomorrow. Thank you.
Sem microfone. Ah, estou com o microfone agora, me ouvem? Certo. Edna, a gente queria agradecer muito a tua mediação, que foi espetacular. Perguntas no alvo, assim, no final, foi muito boa. Além dos brilhantes insights que o Andy proporcionou para nós, né? Foi um final de dia fantástico. O Andy está se despedindo aqui no chat por escrito para nós. E a gente vai também se despedindo de você, né, Clarissa? Agradecendo muito.
Exatamente, Edna, é um prazer te ter aqui de novo, né? A gente que te acompanha aí, e você que nos acompanhou durante todo o dia de hoje aqui, comentando no chat, mas dizer assim, que ter você, né, nesse mundo da economia criativa tem uma relevância, assim, que a economia criativa não seria a mesma sem a Edna, né, no mundo. Então, é muito importante esse momento, agradecer a sua generosidade, né, e a do professor Pratt, por compartilhar o conhecimento, né, e a gente vê, assim, os ícones que são mundialmente, né, então, fomos hoje agraciados, novamente, mais um ano com a presença de vocês, e Piquet, acho que daqui a 2 anos temos que fazer um evento finalmente presencial, chamando a Edna, chamando Pratt presencialmente aqui, né, fazer Floripa e Porto Alegre, e não vamos perder esses vínculos, né, porque eu acho que isso fica, assim, essa construção coletiva, né, que temos tanto apreço. Então, Edna, muito obrigada.
Estão ouvindo? Eu é que agradeço, porque eu acho que vocês estão fazendo um trabalho extraordinário. Eu quero dizer que eu fico meio lá e cá, e o dia que eu passei hoje com vocês me deu uma injeção de ânimo. Eu fiquei tão feliz de ouvir tanta coisa interessante, tanta gente fazendo um trabalho tão bom, tão sério, as novas pesquisas, todos os trabalhos que estão sendo feitos em toda parte do Brasil. Eu acho que isso é maravilhoso, né? Porque cada um dando a sua contribuição, e a gente sabe que a economia criativa é isso, né? O que a gente falou é fragmentada, mas, na verdade, cada um tem um papel nessa economia, né? Tem papel das políticas públicas, tem papel dos intermediários, tem papel dos territórios, enfim, cada um tem o seu papel. E eu acho que com esse evento vocês estão dando assim uma visão global do que está acontecendo no Brasil, e eu acho que isso é extremamente positivo. Vocês estão plantando sementes que certamente vão gerar muitos frutos. Então, eu que agradeço e parabenizo a toda a equipe, a vocês dois pela força, pela devoção, pelo entusiasmo de organizar esse evento. Então, sucesso. E conte sempre comigo. Sou fã de vocês.
Obrigado, Edna. E, Edna, você tocou num ponto fundamental, que é essa fragmentação, que é real na economia criativa. Todos nós sabemos, existem muitas diferenças. Mas qual é a resposta à fragmentação? É a colaboração, é a criação de conexões entre diferentes, entre um pintor e um antiquário, entre um antiquário e um hotel, entre um hotel e um restaurante, entre um restaurante e um bar musical, que normalmente não se encontram, estão nos seus guetos culturais, né, como ele mesmo diz, Não, eu trabalho no audiovisual. Não, eu sou pintor. E é isso que os territórios criativos permitem, porque é no território que essas diferenças se encontram, não é verdade? Porque eles são vizinhos, e eles têm um destino comum no território. Então, por isso que a tua colocação foi muito importante no final, gostei muito mesmo. Então,
até a próxima.
Até a próxima, isso mesmo.
Beijo.